So welcome to week 7 of our exploration of the fundamental teaching of the Buddha, the Noble Eightfold Path. I had the privilege of starting our journey looking at each of the limbs of the Noble Eightfold Path on the 27th of March when I described perfect vision. And today we've reached the 6th limb, that of perfect effort. So let's have a look at one way in which we can describe the path. Thanks, Ed. So this simple table shows how we can map the Eightfold Path onto the threefold way of ethics, meditation, and wisdom. It also articulates how our teacher and the founder of Triratna, Sangarachida, describes the two paths, a path of vision and a path of transformation. And if you've attended any of the previous weeks of this series, you'll have heard many times that this is not a linear path. We're often working on a number of limbs of the path simultaneously. And what's key about perfect vision is that as we refine our understanding and practice of the transformation limbs, they inform and refine our vision, helping us to see more and more clearly. And as our vision improves, so we see the next area of transformation that's required. So what are we looking at this week? So over the last 4 weeks, as we've started to explore the path of transformation, we've discovered that the second, third, and fourth limbs of the path are all about transforming the individual. Whereas last week we heard from Silanatha that the limb of perfect livelihood is ultimately about the transformation of society as a whole. And this week we return to transforming the self, but with a specific focus on the fundamental transformation of the mind, the start of 3 limbs that look at transforming the mind. So the remaining 3 limbs are centered around what we often refer to as our mental states. So we'll get into that shortly. However, Sangarachida also describes perfect effort as fundamental to spiritual life. So, and he says it's so important to be aware that the spiritual life, the Dharma life, if you like, is an active life. It's not a passive life. It's not a life where we can sit around just reading, listening to talks, and just simply gaining knowledge. What we hear, what we learn, we need to discover ways of enacting, of bringing those teachings of the Buddha to life. And that requires effort. And it's not about being busy, simply running around, multitasking. What it means is that there is the need for mental and spiritual effort, as well as the making of physical effort, for example, to get up in the morning, to meditate, to engage with others in the development of spiritual friendships and so on. And that will sometimes involve us going outside of our comfort zone and hanging in there when things get a bit difficult. So it's a life where we need to make an effort, we need to try, and we will fail. We will fall short of what we expected to achieve or hoped for, but we need to continually renew our effort. So the spiritual life is not simply about reading of the life and efforts of others. It's taking that as an inspiration to apply effort in our own lives. And I was reminded only yesterday morning during our 8:30 morning meditation tuning that many of you are doing just that. So let's see how Sangarachida describes perfect effort. He talks about it in terms of it being twofold in nature. So in terms of, so let's just read that actually. So perfect effort is twofold. There's a general perfect effort and a specific perfect effort. Though the 6th stage or limb of the Noble Eightfold Path is specifically concerned with perfect effort. Some degree of effort is needed for all stages of the path. So in terms of the general effort, I mentioned getting up in the mornings to meditate, or making the effort to prioritize coming to classes, which those of you who are hearing this live have done. When we have many other calls on our time, but it's important, as I said, not just to busy ourselves. And I'm certainly someone who can appear to be on the go all of the time, or a lot of the time. And I can't deny that I do seem to get a lot done. But for me, the difference is in my state of mind when I'm turning towards and tackling things that need to be done. When I'm just responding creatively to what appears before me, rather than seeing things as work or a chore, then I experience a sense of lightness, joy even. Occasionally, I get a glimpse of what this effort is called by those on the Bodhisattva path, and that is Leela, the word Leela meaning play. And it really does feel like a delight to be doing things, especially for others. But if my preferences creep in, if my views start to make themselves known, then I can quickly start to feel bogged down. That lightness disappears and I begin to feel the stickiness of the mud around my feet and ankles. And it's then that I need to apply effort. So this brings me to one of my favorite stories from the Pali Canon. It's the story of Sona. This is an abridged version, and it goes something like this. Sona is the son of a nobleman who's so refined and delicate that hair grew on the soles of his feet. Well, as a lot of these stories go, at some point he meets the Buddha and decides to become a disciple, goes off into the forest to practice. And during the course of hours and hours of walking meditation, during which he's contemplating the Buddha's teaching, his delicate feet start to bleed. And he's on the verge of giving up and considering returning to a much easier life when the Buddha appears, meets up with him and inquires about his practice. And when Sona tells him of his bleeding feet, the Buddha, who knew that Sona had played the stringed instrument known as the veena, which is a kind of lute, the Buddha says to him, Sona, before, when you were a house dweller, were you skilled at playing the veena? Yes, Lord. And what do you think? When the strings of your veena were too taut, was your veena in tune and playable? No, Lord. And what do you think? When the strings of your veena were too loose, was your veena in tune and playable? No, Lord. And what do you think? When the strings of your veena were neither too taut nor too loose, but tuned to be right on pitch, was your veena in tune and playable? Yes, Lord. In the same way, Sona, over-aroused persistence leads to restlessness. Overly slack persistence leads to laziness. Thus, you should determine the right pitch for your persistence. Attune the pitch of the 5 faculties to that, and there pick up your theme. So I haven't got time to go into the 5 spiritual faculties. I can feel another series coming on. But I think you can probably get from that the Buddha is clearly suggesting that a balance needs to be found between over-aroused persistence, or willfulness, as we often call it, and overly slack persistence, or laziness. So being aware of our tendency in this regard is really important in being able to develop a phrase I like as a sustainable Dharma life. And not one of great enthusiasm and effort, followed by long periods of laziness. So it's that sustainable Dharma effort that I'm looking for and trying to develop. So that's the general approach to perfect effort. Let's take a look at the specific approach to perfect effort and where this limb of the Eightfold Path is really focused. And of course, it's on the mind. So let's remind ourselves of the importance of this with 2 famous verses from the Dhammapada, which I'm sure you all have heard many times before. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one acts, speaks, or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. And what the Buddha is pointing to very clearly is the fundamental importance of the mind. It's the mind that determines not just our thoughts, but what and how we communicate with others, as well as our actions. Actions and communication are just expressions of our mind. Therefore, it's really crucial that our mind is pure, or that we cultivate skillfulness. So let's have a look at how the Buddha specifically suggests we do this. And how does a bhikkhu, so bhikkhu here is a monk, but it equally applies to nuns and to ourselves as practitioners. How does a bhikkhu develop and cultivate the 4 right efforts? A bhikkhu generates desire for the non-arising of unarisen, evil, unwholesome states. He makes an effort, arouses energy, applies his mind, and strives. He generates desire for the abandoning of arisen, evil, unwholesome states. He makes an effort, arouses energy, applies his mind, and strives. He generates desire for the arising of unarisen, wholesome states. He makes an effort, arouses energy, applies his mind, and strives. He generates desire for the maintenance of arisen, wholesome states, for their non-decay, increase, and expansion. He makes an effort, arouses energy, applies his mind, and strives. These are the 4 right efforts. So there's quite a lot to take in there, but if we go on to the next slide, I've tried to simplify this a little and have used the translations that Sangarachida used for each of the 4 efforts, or strivings, or exertions, as they're often translated. So on the left, we have the 2 types of mental states, which I've called unwholesome or unskillful, and wholesome or skillful. You could use other words. Unwholesome or unskillful mental states are those contaminated by craving, hatred, or delusion. And for those unskillful mental states, we either prevent them from arising or eradicate them if they've already arisen. Wholesome or skillful mental states are those like metta, kindness, generosity. And for skillful mental states, we either develop them and bring them into being, or maintain them once they have arisen. So these are the 4 right efforts: prevent, eradicate, develop, and maintain. A simple but really effective little list. So I wanted to bring this to life a little with an analogy. And like all analogies, well, certainly all of my analogies, it doesn't really work in all circumstances, but this is how I like to learn best. So I'm doing the talk, so there you go. So I've taken the analogy of growing plants in my garden, because I thought that might be just something at this time of year, springtime, and for some of you, you might be able to relate to this. So for each right effort, I'm going to share an image which helps me to really understand the teaching. So to begin with, I'm just setting the scene here, that I'm setting out with the intention to grow some plants, and the plants represent my skillful mental states. So when we sit down, for example, to meditate, when we do metta bhavana, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to cultivate metta. So let's have a look at our first little image. Thank you, Ed. So to really give my plants a chance, I need to set up the right conditions. So I have my greenhouse, which will help to protect the seeds that I'm going to initially plant from cold, snails, slugs, birds. So in a similar way, we need to protect our mind, and not just for meditation, not just during meditation. Of course, when we meditate, we can often be more aware of the snails and birds which want to eat our seeds. But actually, we need to prevent unskillfulness arising at all times. And we do this with something, again, many of you have heard of, which we call guarding the gates of the senses. Or in the case of my seeds, by putting them in the greenhouse and making sure the door is shut. So we need to be aware of what we expose ourselves to. Maybe we are drawn to exciting drama with themes of conflict and revenge. And even those that result in a happy ending with all the baddies vanquished will have an effect on our mind. Maybe we feel the need to constantly keep up to date with the news. This has been a particular issue for me over the years, but I have to say during the pandemic, I realized that if I didn't know the exact number of new cases in the world each day or the number of tests carried out yesterday, it wouldn't actually affect those things. So my knowledge or lack of knowledge of world events actually doesn't affect those events, at least not in the vast majority of cases. However, the exposure to the constant updating of the distress in the world does have an impact on my mental states. And sadly, that effect can leave me overwhelmed and not really able to help the people around me who I could actually be of some help to. So there are just a couple of quick examples on guarding the gates of the senses and preventing the arising of unarisen, unwholesome or unskillful mental states. So back to my little analogy. Now we have, some of you may recognize in the foreground there, a wild strawberry plant out in the garden. But what is it surrounded by? Well, lots of sprouting bindweed. And despite turning the soil and removing as much of these as I could before planting, I just don't seem to be able to prevent these little fellas from growing in parts of my garden. And in just the same way that some of our unskillful tendencies have a habit of dissolving quietly into the background, and we can delude ourselves by thinking that we've cracked it. And then we get that wet, cold Tuesday evening when no one else is around. And well, you can fill in the blanks for yourself. And before we know it, the bindweed is sprouting up again. This then takes us to the second of the 4 right efforts, and that of eradication. So we need to pull up this little menace by the roots. We'll have a picture of that in a minute. We know what happens if we don't. If we just let ourselves off, well, it was a wet and cold Tuesday evening. I was alone. No one wanted me. No, we can't take that approach. We need to get to the root of the problem. And to be clear, I'm not advocating a hard line consisting of beating ourselves up or punishing ourselves for being weak. But we do need to apply effort. We need to try to get to the bottom of the problem. What led me to this situation, and how might I be able to better guard the gates of the senses and prevent a repeat occurrence? But once the old bindweed's there, it really has to be dealt with. It has to be pulled out. Otherwise, it will spread and strangle our fledgling strawberry plant before we ever taste any fruit. So now let's turn to how we develop and maintain the beautiful plants that we are trying to grow. And again, I'd point to the importance of conditions. We need to understand the needs of the plant we are trying to grow, just as we need to understand what unconditional, universal loving kindness is really like, what true open-handed generosity feels like. So we create the right conditions to give ourselves the best possible opportunity to be able to grow and develop those qualities. So back to the plants. So here we have our little seedling in a tray to help prevent contamination. They're in the greenhouse and they're labeled, so we know exactly what they are and exactly what this particular type of plant needs in terms of temperature, water, and food. And the same is true of the positive mental states we're trying to cultivate. Each will need appropriate conditions to begin to germinate. So we need to find out what these are in our own experience. How can I give myself the opportunity to be generous so that generosity spontaneously germinates? The effort is often on the preparation. The magic of germination happens without our conscious intervention. Similarly, if we create the right mental states, when we're presented with someone who is suffering, if we have metta present, then compassionate action will arise. We'll naturally just help. We won't have to think about it. Just as when we've created the right conditions for our little plants, they will begin to grow. But we've seen the persistence of the bindweed, and possibly we can identify with the persistence of those unskillful habits and patterns of behavior. So next, then we need to maintain and protect our plant as it grows. So here we have two essentials for transferring my plant from its seedling tray to a pot and then into the garden. Some nice compost that it loves, and of course plenty of water. So with our skillful mental states, it's also a matter of keeping them fed with opportunities in the same way in which we help them to develop in the first place. However, there is one other way of maintaining, and this involves talking to my plants and offering them encouragement. Here's me having a chat with a couple of pansies. So likewise, to help ourselves and others to maintain, appreciate and celebrate our skillful mental states, we can rejoice in those qualities. We can rejoice in ourselves and feel metta towards ourselves for those acts of kindness, compassion and generosity. And of equal importance, we can rejoice in the qualities of others. So last night was an amazing example of that within our Sangha. And this helps them to maintain those qualities, but it also acts as positive reinforcement for ourselves in the importance of those qualities, those skillful mental states. So I hope you've managed to hang in there with my shaky analogy, and it's brought some life to what is really a wonderful teaching of the four right efforts and the importance of being able to make an effort to prevent and eradicate unskillful mental states and to develop and maintain skillful ones.